There are places in this world that history itself refuses to remember. Villages where maps fade, roads twist into nothingness, and even the soil seemed to whisper secrets too heavy to be carried forward. Thamma was one such village. Buried deep in the forests of Madhya Pradesh, far from the highways and railway lines, it was the kind of place you would never find unless it wanted you to. The trees grew thicker the closer you got. The air felt heavier, as though the forest itself was reluctant to let outsiders through. Birds would fall silent. Insects would vanish. And if you tried to measure the distance, you would find that your compass spun aimlessly, refusing to guide you. The first recorded mention of Thamma was in an old British-era gazette. A single line, a single warning. Thamma, a settlement abandoned for reasons best left undisturbed. After that, nothing. No census records. No government archives. No mention in the decades that followed. It was as though the village had been erased deliberately, as though someone or something did not want its story to be told. But stories, they always find a way back. Ayushmann and Rashmika were not looking for trouble when they stumbled across Thamma. They were filmmakers, urban storytellers searching for authentic folklore for a documentary project. Rumors had reached them about a vanished village, where no one lived and yet smoke was sometimes seen rising from rooftops, where no one prayed and yet chants could be heard at night. They were told, don't go there, not even in daylight. Which, of course, made them go. Their journey began innocently, a hired jeep, a villager who reluctantly agreed to guide them, provided they promised to leave before dusk. But even he abandoned them halfway, muttering that the forest ahead was unnatural. The path grew narrower. The trees closed in. And then, suddenly, as though the forest had been holding its breath, they emerged into a clearing. Thamma, the village, lay sprawled like a corpse under the sun. Crumbling mud houses with roofs caved in. Doors that swayed on rusted hinges. Wells choked with moss. And at the center, an ancient banyan tree. Its roots crawled across the ground like veins, gripping the earth in a suffocating embrace. Beneath it, the soil was blackened, as though scorched by fire that never healed. For a long time, neither Ayushmann nor Rashmika spoke. There was something unnatural about the silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of listening, as though the village itself had ears. As though every broken wall, every hollow window was watching. They set up their cameras. At first, everything was technical: frames, lighting, sound checks. But the longer they stayed, the harder it became to ignore the weight pressing against their chests. Even the air felt wrong. Do you feel that? Rashmika whispered. Ayushmann nodded. Like the air's thicker here. But it wasn't just the air. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. A crow perched on the banyan did not move, not even when they walked directly beneath it. And the houses, though clearly abandoned, seemed freshly disturbed, footprints in the dust. A half-burned incense stick near a doorstep. A door that was shut firmly now stood ajar. Still, they convinced themselves it was imagination. The brain playing tricks in an unfamiliar place, until the sun began to sink. The first sound came like a tremor in the earth, a low hum, a vibration that began in the roots of the banyan and spread through the ground. Then, faintly, a chant, a voice without a body. Do you hear that? Rashmika's voice trembled. Ayushmann raised his camera, recording. It's coming from under the tree. But the banyan's roots shifted, almost imperceptibly, but enough to reveal an opening, a hollow in the earth, like a mouth yawning wide. The chant grew louder, though no one was visible. The words were in a language neither of them recognized, yet the tone carried menace. And then they saw it. From the hollow beneath the tree, a hand emerged, gray. With her fingers too long, nails curling like claws, it gripped the soil, dragging itself out slowly, not alive, not entirely dead. Something caught between. The air turned cold. The crow above let out a single piercing cry and then fell silent again. Rashmika grabbed Ayushmann's arm. We need to leave. Now. But the hand was not alone. More shapes began to stir beneath the tree. Figures half buried in the soil, twisted, deformed, their faces hidden in shadow. And then the whisper. It did not come from the ground. It came from everywhere, from the walls, from the roofs, from the very air. A single word, breathed into their ears as though by 100 unseen mouths. Stay. Ayushmann and Rashmika froze. Their cameras continued to record red lights blinking in the dark. But every instinct in their bodies screamed to run. Still they hesitated, because the horror was not just in what they saw, it was in what they felt. The village wanted them there. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing isn't what refuses to let you in. It's what refuses to let you leave. Night fell over Thamma like a curtain drawn too quickly. One moment, the last rays of the sun lit the village in a faint, reddish glow. The next, it was swallowed whole by darkness. There were no stars overhead, no moonlight piercing the canopy. It was as if the sky itself had turned its face away. Ayushmann and Rashmika huddled near the banyan tree, cameras still rolling, too paralyzed to decide whether to flee or stay. Their breathing was sharp, uneven. The whispering had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. Silence that was aware. Silence that pressed against their ears until they could hear nothing but their own heartbeat. Then, footsteps. Not theirs. Not human. The crunch of soil, the drag of something heavy against the ground. Slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the ruined houses. Rashmika clutched Ayushmann's wrist. Someone's here. But when they turned, the streets were empty. The houses loomed like hollow skulls, their windows nothing but black sockets staring outward. And yet the footsteps grew louder, closer. Ayushmann raised his camera again. Through the lens, the world seemed sharper, more focused. That was when he saw them, shapes moving at the edges of the village. Figures stepping out from the shadows. Not the twisted corpses they had glimpsed under the banyan, but something else. They were tall, wrapped in white cloth that clung to their bodies like shrouds. Their faces were hidden behind masks, carved from wood, painted with streaks of ash and vermilion. Each mask bore a different expression: grief, anger, joy, terror. But none of them were alive. Their eyes were hollow holes that revealed nothing but blackness. One by one, they emerged, filling the narrow lanes surrounding the banyan tree. Their movements were unnervingly synchronized, as if guided by a single will. Rashmika's voice cracked. "Who are they?" No one answered. Instead, the figures began to hum, a sound that rattled inside the chest more than in the ears. Low, guttural, rising in rhythm. The same chant that had seeped from beneath the roots, now carried by dozens of unseen throats. Ayushmann's rational mind screamed to document, to record, to capture what was happening. But a deeper instinct, a primal fear, told him that pointing the camera was an invitation, that the act of watching made him part of whatever ritual this was. The figures circled the banyan. Their steps were heavy, but precise, thudding against the soil in unison. Dust rose with each stomp, mingling with the thick smell of burned incense. And then one of them stopped, turned, stared directly at them. Its mask bore a frozen smile painted with cracked red pigment that resembled blood. Slowly it raised its arm, pointing at Ayushmann and Rashmika. At that gesture, the chanting ceased. The circle opened. Two figures stepped forward, moving closer with deliberate slowness. Rashmika's panic broke. "We can't stay. Ayushmann, we have to run." They stumbled back, dragging their equipment with them, until they reached the edge of the village. But the forest that had once seemed like an escape now loomed like a wall. The path they had entered through was gone, swallowed by undergrowth. The trees pressed so tightly together that even light could not pass. Trapped. Behind them, the figures advanced. Their footsteps were no longer in unison, but scattered, chaotic. Mask tilted, expressions grotesque in the flicker of the dying lantern light. Some crawled, some walked bent backward, spines arching unnaturally. Others moved as if in water, slow and fluid, their heads jerking at impossible angles. Ayushmann's camera caught every moment, though he no longer intended to film. His trembling hands gripped the device like a weapon, as if the lens might shield them. They ran not toward the forest, but deeper into the village, weaving between houses, trying desperately to find a way out. But every alley twisted back toward the banyan. Every turn led them closer to the tree at the center, as if the village itself was folding around them. Rashmika gasped, nearly stumbling. "It's like a maze, it doesn't want us to leave." And she was right. The village was alive, shifting. Corridors lengthened. Houses they had already passed now stood in front of them again. Doors slammed shut without wind. Windows cracked as unseen hands pressed against the glass from inside. Ayushmann pulled Rashmika into a house, the nearest shelter he could find. Inside, it smelled of rot and damp earth. The floor was uneven, covered in a thin layer of ash. A shrine stood in the corner, its idol smashed, its face missing. Candles, long melted, still burned faintly as if relit by unseen hands. They pressed themselves against the wall, breathing hard, trying to stay silent. The sound of footsteps echoed outside, slow. Searching, the hum of the chant returned, quieter now, as though meant only for them. Then scratching. From inside the house, the walls trembled. Nails dragged across wood, carving deep grooves. Ayushmann lifted his camera and pointed it at the sound. Through the lens, he saw what the naked eye could not. Hands, hundreds of them, pressing against the inside of the walls, their skin stretched thin, their veins pulsing black. They clawed outward, straining as if desperate to tear through. Rashmika covered her mouth to keep from screaming. Tears welled in her eyes. She shook her head violently, whispering, "No more, I don't want to see any more." Ayushmann lowered the camera, heart pounding. But the scratching continued. The wood cracked. A hand broke through, skeletal fingers groping for them. That was enough. They bolted, crashing through the door into the open street. The masked figures were waiting. But now they were not moving. They stood perfectly still, as if statues placed in the road, their heads tilted slightly, masks gleaming in the faint light. And then as Ayushmann and Rashmika stumbled between them, one of the figures whispered, not in chant, not in unison, but in a voice human enough to chill their blood, "Why did you come here?" They froze. The voice came from behind a mask painted with sorrow, a woman's voice, hoarse, tired, filled with centuries of grief. "Why did you wake us?" Ayushmann could not answer. Rashmika pulled at him, urging him forward, but his feet felt rooted. His mind screamed for reason. He wanted to ask, "Who are you? What do you want?" But the words never came. The figures moved again, this time not in circles. They parted, opening a path, a narrow lane that led back to the banyan. The message was clear. They were being summoned, and though every instinct begged them to resist, something in the air, the weight, the pressure, compelled them forward. As if refusing was not an option. As if Thamma itself had decided. Step by step, they walked toward the banyan, and beneath its twisted roots, the earth pulsed like a heartbeat. The banyan tree loomed before them like a gatekeeper of forgotten realms. Its roots, thick and serpentine, wound across the earth in grotesque coils, gripping the soil as though strangling it. Beneath those roots, The hollow gaped wider now, no longer a crack in the ground, but an opening like a wound in the earth itself. Ayushmann and Rashmika stopped a few feet away, trembling. Around them, the masked figures closed their circle once more. Their chanting ceased, replaced by an even more dreadful sound. Silence. This was not an ordinary silence. It was purposeful, ritualistic. A silence so absolute that even their ragged breathing seemed offensive within it. The figures stood motionless, mask tilted toward the hollow, waiting. And then movement. The soil beneath the tree began to shift, rising and falling as though something massive stirred just beneath the surface. From the opening, a thick smoke unfurled, oily black and foul-smelling, carrying the stench of burnt flesh. It coiled upward, clinging to the branches, wrapping the banyan in a veil of shadow. Ayushmann instinctively raised his camera, but Rashmika grabbed his arm. Stop. Don't film this. Her voice cracked with desperation. Whatever this is, it doesn't want to be seen. But Ayushmann's hands trembled with conflict. The need to record, to document, battle with the primal urge to run. The red recording light blinked like a heartbeat. Then, without warning, the masked figures began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they sank to their knees, lowering their heads to the ground in perfect unison. Not one voice rose. Not one sound escaped. It was a ritual of silence, their submission absolute. Ayushmann and Rashmika exchanged a terrified glance. What are they bowing to? She whispered. They got their answer. From within the hollow, something began to emerge. At first, it looked like smoke solidifying, taking shape. A figure hunched and twisted, draped in tatters of cloth that looked centuries old. Its limbs were too long, joints bending at unnatural angles. Its face, or what should have been a face, was concealed beneath a veil of matted hair. But the smell, it was unbearable, like graves ripped open, like flesh left to rot in the sun. The masked figures trembled, but none dared raise their heads. This was worship. This was devotion. Ayushmann's chest tightened. His mind screamed the truth he did not want to accept. This is his Thamma. The entity moved slowly, its presence heavier than stone. Every step it took was accompanied by the sound of cracking wood, as if the earth itself strained beneath its weight. It stopped in front of the banyan, head tilting unnaturally as though sniffing the air. And then its voice. Not a whisper, not a chant, but a sound that crawled directly into the bones. You do not belong here. The words were not spoken in Hindi, not in any language they recognized, yet their meaning was unmistakable, seared into their minds as if branded. Rashmika gripped Ayushmann's arm. We have to go, we have to. But before she could finish, the entity raised its hand. The ground beneath them shifted. Roots shot upward, twisting around their ankles like shackles. The village itself had bound them in place. The silent ritual continued. The masked figures began to sway, their bodies trembling as if caught in invisible waves. Though no sound escaped them, the air vibrated with unspoken prayer. The silence was their offering. Ayushmann gasped for breath, his chest tightening with panic. His camera slipped from his hands, landing in the dirt with a dull thud. Yet it continued to record, its lens capturing the unspeakable. The entity drew closer, its face lowering toward theirs. Through the curtain of tangled hair, glimpses of decayed skin, hollow sockets, and blackened teeth became visible. Its breath reeked of centuries-old decay. It spoke again. Once this place was alive. Once they called upon me, and they stayed. As it uttered the last word, the masked figures lifted their heads, slowly, mechanically. One by one, they removed their masks. Ayushmann and Rashmika recoiled in horror. These were no living villagers. Their skin was stretched taut across brittle bones. Their eyes were sunken pits, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Their mouths hung open in silent screams, lips cracked, teeth broken. They were not people. They were remnants, devotees who had given themselves so completely to Thamma that they no longer existed as human. The mask had not been disguises. They had been prisons, symbols meant to hide what they had become. Rashmika sobbed quietly, trembling uncontrollably. Ayushmann tried to pull her free, but the roots tightened, digging into their flesh. Blood trickled down their ankles. The entity raised its hand again, and the silent congregation mirrored it, palms outstretched toward the two intruders. Their mouths moved soundlessly, forming words they could not hear, but the weight of those unspoken syllables pressed down on them like a storm. Ayushmann's vision blurred. His ears rang. He realized with dread that the silence was no longer around them. It was inside them. Their voices were being stolen. Their breath, their very ability to scream. Rashmika tried to shout, but only a dry gasp escaped. Her eyes widened in terror. The entity leaned closer, its face now inches from theirs. Its hollow sockets bore into them, and with a voice like rusted iron, it whispered, "Now you stay." The roots constricted tighter. The villagers swayed faster. The silence thickened until the world itself seemed to vanish into nothingness. And in that suffocating void, Ayushmann and Rashmika realized the truth. This was not just a ritual. It was a binding, a curse, and they were the next offering. The silence was unbearable. Not the kind that gives peace, but the kind that eats away at sanity. Ayushmann and Rashmika stood frozen, their voices trapped somewhere between their lungs and the void around them. The banyan's roots coiled like serpents, biting deeper into their skin, feeding on their blood. Then came the whispers, not from the entity, not from the silent congregation, but from the earth itself, from beneath the banyan tree, where the soil shifted as though something vast and restless moved below. The whispers slithered into their ears, soft at first, almost delicate, fragments of words in a dozen languages, some ancient, some broken, some their own. Help us? Stay with us? Breathe with us? Never leave. They weren't voices of strangers. They were familiar. Ayushmann's late grandmother. Rashmika's childhood friend who died young. Teachers, neighbors, people long gone. Each voice tugged at their hearts, tempting them to surrender. Rashmika shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. She pressed her hands against her ears, but the whispers came from within. The more she resisted, the clearer they became, until it felt as if her own mind was turning against her. Ayushmann tried to focus on the entity before them, its grotesque form swaying with unnatural rhythm. But then he heard a voice that broke him entirely. Ayushmann, the whisper croaked, identical to his own tone, his own breath. You belong here. He bit down hard on his lip, drawing blood, trying to anchor himself to reality. But the taste of iron only thickened the haze. Around them, the congregation of masked villagers swayed faster, their hollow eyes glowing brighter, their bodies convulsing in silence. Their mouths moved, but no sound escaped. And yet, Ayushmann and Rashmika heard everything. Each whisper they heard came from those lifeless mouths. The banyan groaned, its branches creaking like bones breaking. The hollow beneath it widened further, and from its depths a new sound emerged, breathing. Deep, rag, unnatural, as though something massive inhaled the very air of the village. The whispers grew frantic, overlapping in chaos. Rashmika collapsed to her knees, clutching her head. Make it stop. She mouthed, but no sound left her lips. Her throat strained in silence. Ayushmann fell beside her, wrapping his arms around her trembling frame, desperate to shield her though he himself was breaking. He tried to speak, to tell her they would survive this, but the silence smothered his voice before it formed. Then a sudden shift. The whispers ceased. The congregation froze. Even the banyan seemed to pause in its grotesque breathing. A single voice replaced them all, low, feminine, heavy with centuries of grief. Do you know why they call me Thamma? The entity straightened, its hair falling aside to reveal more of its ruined face. A withered mouth twisted into a grin, teeth black and broken. They once called me Mother. The villagers bowed their heads at the word, as though struck by reverence. The entity's voice crawled across the clearing like smoke. They prayed to me when the crops failed. They gave me their blood when disease spread. They offered me their children when famine came. And I gave them life, I gave them breath. But they never left, they never could. Because once you take from Thamma, its withered hand rose claw, like fingers trembling in the air. You belong to Thamma. The congregation lifted their faces again. From their mouths, whispers poured once more. Only now Ayushmann and Rashmika understood the language. It was not prayer. It was confession. Each voice cried out sins long buried, betrayals, murders, secrets hidden in the soil. One by one they confessed, not for forgiveness, but for permanence, for binding themselves to the curse. Ayushmann's stomach twisted. He realized the whispers they had heard earlier. The voices of loved ones were not real, they were bait, memories reshaped into chains. The entity turned its hollow gaze to them. You came here seeking stories. You will leave here as one. The roots wreath pulling tighter. Ayushmann's vision blurred as pain seared his legs. Rashmika whimpered silently, her body trembling under the strain. But then something strange happened. Ayushmann's fallen camera, still recording in the dirt, emitted a faint hum. Its lens flickered, catching the faint glow of the villagers' eyes. The red recording light blinked brighter, faster, like a pulse. And for a fleeting moment the whispers faltered. The congregation hesitated, their swaying stilled. Even the entity turned its head slightly, as though noticing the lens. Ayushmann's mind raced. The camera was seeing something, capturing something the human eye was not meant to. Something Thamma did not want revealed. He reached for it, straining against the roots, his fingers inches away from the device. The entity hissed, a sound that shook the ground. The banyan's branches snapped downward like whips, striking the soil around him, warning him to stop. But Ayushmann's fingertips brushed the camera. He felt its hum vibrate against his skin. Rashmika saw him, her eyes widening with desperate hope. The whispers rose again, furious this time, crashing into their minds like a tidal wave. But Ayushmann clutched the camera tight, pulling it into his chest, and in that instant the whispers changed. No longer voices of the dead, no longer illusions of memory. They became screams, agonized, furious, uncontrollable. The villagers shrieked without sound, their jaws distending grotesquely as their silence cracked. The entity howled a guttural roar that split the night air. For the first time since stepping into Thamma, the silence was broken. The silence shattered into chaos. The congregation convulsed, their heads jerking violently as though unseen hands twisted their necks. Their hollow eyes flared with white light, glowing so bright it hurt to look at them. The banyan's roots wreathed uncontrollably, tightening around Ayushmann and Rashmika, then loosening, then tightening again as if uncertain. Ayushmann clutched the camera to his chest. Its screen flickered, glitching between static and strange images, shadows moving in reverse, faces that weren't there, fragments of the villagers as they once were, alive and screaming. It was as though the lens had pierced into another layer of Thamma's reality. The entity staggered, its grotesque limbs shaking. For the first time, it seemed unstable, less invincible. Its veil of hair whipped in all directions, revealing glimpses of a decayed skull, skin hanging in tatters, eyes that were not eyes at all but empty voids leaking black smoke. It roared, and the ground split beneath the banyan. From the hollow surged a torrent of air so cold it burned. Dust and ash filled the clearing, obscuring everything. Ayushmann covered Rashmika's face with his arm, shielding her from the storm, though he could barely breathe himself. When the dust began to settle, they saw it. One of the villagers, the woman with the sorrow mask, was gone. Her place in the circle stood empty, her mask lying in the dirt, cracked in half. The others swayed violently, their silent ritual unraveling, their unity broken. Rashmika's wide eyes locked on the mask. Her lips trembled, forming soundless words. She disappeared. Ayushmann tightened his grip on the camera. The camera did this. He mouthed. He didn't know how, but he was certain. Something about recording Thamma disrupted its hold, tore at the bindings of silence. The entity noticed too. Its head snapped toward him, its hollow sockets narrowing. It reached out a clawed hand, fingers stretching unnaturally long, aiming for the camera. The villagers echoed the movement, dozens of skeletal arms clawing toward him as though the device itself was a threat to their existence. Ayushmann pulled Rashmika to her feet, forcing her forward. The roots had weakened in the chaos, slackening just enough for them to stumble free. Blood ran down their ankles, but they didn't care. They ran. The village twisted around them again, but this time Ayushmann held the camera high, its flickering screen casting a pale glow on the walls. Each time the lens caught a villager's hollow face, their form wavered, trembling as though unstable. Some vanished entirely, leaving behind only their masks. Others crumbled into ash, scattered by the faintest breeze. But the banyan was alive. Its branches read like tendrils, sweeping across the streets, blocking paths, herding them back toward the center. Each time Ayushmann lifted the camera toward it, the branches recoiled, but only slightly. As if resisting an unbearable light, they burst into one of the ruined houses for cover. Inside, the walls pulsed faintly, breathing like lungs. A broken cradle lay in the corner, rocking though no wind touched it. Rashmika's eyes filled with terror as she pointed. The cradle was empty, but in the camera's screen a baby lay inside, pale and still, its eyes open and black as void. Ayushmann turned the lens away, refusing to look further. He knew if he watched too long, the images would cling to him. Rashmika clung to his arm. Her lips moved frantically. "We can't escape. It won't let us." Ayushmann shook his head. His chest burned from silence, from the weight of words he could not release. But his eyes were resolute. He raised the camera again, pointing it at the wall. The wood split, dozens of skeletal hands retreating in sudden panic. That was when they heard it. An actual voice, not a whisper. A faint human cry carried on the wind. Help! It wasn't theirs. It wasn't the villagers. It was someone else. They followed the sound, stumbling back into the open street. The cry came from near the banyan, faint but urgent, echoing through the hollow. Ayushmann hesitated. Rashmika shook her head furiously, pulling him back, begging him to run. But the voice grew louder, more desperate. "Please don't leave me here." Against every instinct, Ayushmann lifted the camera toward the hollow. What he saw made his blood run cold. Inside the hollow, through the flickering lens, were faces. Dozens of them. Men, women, children. Their features twisted in anguish, their hands clawing at invisible walls, their mouths open in eternal screams. The souls of those who had been swallowed by Thamma. And among them the sorrow-masked woman who had vanished. Her face was human now, though pale, her eyes pleading. Rashmika grabbed Ayushmann's arm, shaking her head violently. "It's a trap." But Ayushmann couldn't look away. His own reflection glared back at him from the lens, distorted, pale, his eyes slowly darkening. The entity's roar shook the village. The ground split wider, the banyan's roots thrashing like furious serpents. Villagers lunged from every direction, clawing at Ayushmann and Rashmika with skeletal fingers. The camera crackled, its screen flickering violently, the red light blinking faster as though it were reaching some breaking point. Ayushmann made a split-second decision. He turned the camera on the entity itself. The moment the lens locked on Thamma, the entity convulsed violently. Its form wavered, splitting into fragments of shadow and bone. Its voice tore through the silence in a deafening scream. The villagers howled voicelessly, collapsing into the dirt, their masks shattering like glass. The banyan's branches rent uncontrollably, ripping chunks of soil from the ground. The hollow widened into a gaping chasm, and then Rashmika screamed. No sound left her throat, but Ayushmann saw her mouth open wide, her face twisted in terror. She pointed downward. Her shadow was gone. She turned frantically, her eyes wild, realizing what it meant. In Thamma, to lose your shadow was to begin disappearing. Already her arm flickered faintly, like static on a broken screen. Ayushmann reached for her, pulling her close, but his camera trembled in his grip, showing her body half transparent in its lens. Rashmika was fading.